All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. This is week 3 in a 9-week course on science and the Bible. And really happy to be able to spend this time with you going into this subject area in great depth. We have a lot of ground to cover, so we will use the 9 weeks and still not have talked about everything that we could have discussed. This evening, I want to provide an overview of the different approaches to the very controversial subject areas of creation and evolution. The focus of what I'm going to be doing in this overview is look at an article that is also part of a book by Eugenie C. Scott. The article or essay is called The Creation-Evolution Continuum. It's one of the assigned readings in the syllabus, and if you do not yet have a copy of the syllabus for this course, I would highly recommend that you get that. You can get a copy of the syllabus for free from the theology program. No problem there. This essay on the creation-evolution continuum appears also in Eugenie Scott's book, Evolution versus Creationism, which first came out in 2004 and has just come out this year in a second edition. And Scott is a very well-known advocate for evolution, particularly in public education, and that is why we're going to be taking a look at this particular work. Let me just pause for a second again and make sure most of you at least are able to hear me. Again, signal that you're hearing me, because we know we do have some people who are having problems. Okay, great. Well, the point of Scott's essay, which is a point that others have made for some time, and I've been making it for a number of years as well, is that there are more than just two options in the evolution-creation controversy. And just pausing here because some people are expressing some difficulty with hearing. There are obviously two major views here that everybody talks about: creationism and evolutionism. But in fact, there are a multiple number of views, and we can identify at least 4 major views that are in some ways very significantly different from one another, and you can expand the number out from 4 to a larger number if you want. And Scott has a list of about 10 different positions, and you could arguably have even more. I have conventionally identified 4 major views to keep things fairly simple. And there are 2 evolutionary views and 2 creationism views. The 2 evolutionary views can be very simply divided into those that affirm the existence of a creator and those that don't. Those that do not affirm the existence of a creator would be in the worldview of atheism or pantheism. Pantheists are also not believers in a creator. Pantheism is the idea that everything is divine, and of course if everything is divine, then it didn't create itself, and there is no creator. Atheists also do not believe in a creator because they do not believe in any kind of transcendent or supernatural being. So in terms of what evolution looks like from an atheist perspective or from a pantheistic perspective, it would be identical. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. So you can lump these two varieties of evolutionism into the one category of non-theistic evolution, theism without a creator. The other alternative evolutionary view is known as theistic evolution. Theistic simply means affirming the existence of a creator God. And so in theistic evolution, the creator God is responsible for the process known as evolution. He is responsible for creating the universe and for guiding its history through a series of processes and changes that bring about the conditions necessary for life, and then that bring about life and all the different kinds of life that we see here on the planet Earth. Now, theistic evolution, strictly speaking, could also come into varieties. Just as I said that non-theistic evolution, you could be an atheist or a pantheist. Theistic evolution, in the general sense I'm using that term, really could be differentiated into a true theism, which affirms the existence of a supernatural creator God who is free to intervene in human history and in cosmic history if he wants to, and so he can, and at least occasionally does miracles. And you would contrast that pure theistic evolution view with a deism. Deism, with a D instead of a TH, is the view that there is a creator God. He is a supernatural being, and he brought the universe into existence. But that's it. After he has created the universe, he sits back and watches the show. He does not intervene. He does not perform miracles within the matrix of the cosmic or human history that unfolds after he's made the universe. So you could be a deist or a theist and hold to what I've called theistic evolution, but of course you could refer to one of them as deistic evolution if you wanted to. So those are the two main kinds of evolution, the evolution without a creator God and evolution with one. And evolution with a creator God allows for some miraculous interventions on the part of God, depending on your theology, so that it need not be what might be considered a pure evolutionism. In other words, you could hold to evolution with some creationist acts of God after the universe comes into existence to bring about certain major changes in the world, such as the origin of life or the origin of the human race. So those are the two major branches or kinds of evolution. Now let's talk about the two major kinds of creationism. And these can be divided simply into their views on the age of the earth. Old earth creationists agree with the time scale that is held to by all evolutionists, that the earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. That's billion with a B. And for those of you who are in England, that's 4,000 million, not 4 million. And so according to this time scale, the universe typically is understood to be older than the Earth considerably, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20 billion years. Scientists are now narrowing it down to 13 to 16 billion. They keep tinkering with the exact number of years, but it's in that range. And the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And human beings have been on the Earth for a considerably shorter period of time than that. According to old Earth creationists, only on the level of thousands of years, whereas the Earth has been here for billions of years. That's a big difference. The other form of creationism, of course, is young Earth creationism, and they simply differ on the age of the Earth. The age of the Earth, according to the young Earth creationist, is only about 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And human beings have been around for all but the first 5 days, literally, of that history. And so there's a major difference of opinion on that. But old Earth creationism and young Earth creationism agree on a lot of other things. They're both creationists, which means, in this context, that they agree not only that there is a creator God, which the theistic evolutionists acknowledge, but that according to both old Earth and young Earth creationists, God supernaturally brought life into existence for the first time on planet Earth by a miraculous intervention. And he is responsible for introducing different kinds of living things on the earth by a number of successive miracles throughout the history of the biosphere, that God supernaturally creates different kinds of organisms at different times, and so that the living things that we see now, according to creationism, both old Earth and young Earth, do not have a common ancestor. Old Earth creationists, young Earth creationists both agree in rejecting the idea that human beings, chimps, trout, roses, etc., cats and dogs, mosquitoes, etc., all descended from an original common ancestor, the first living thing that came into existence on the earth some 2 or 3 billion years ago, perhaps. That scenario, which is basic to the way most people understand evolutionism, is rejected by both young Earth and old Earth creationists. All right, so that's a very simple overview of these four major views. Now, Scott, in her essay, The Creation-Evolution Continuum, distinguishes a number of other positions, either further to the extremes of either side of those four that I've talked about, especially more extreme than even young Earth creationism, or perhaps in between some of these views that we've talked about. Now, Scott says this in her essay. Her main point, she says, is to criticize the assumption that there are really only two views, creationism and evolutionism, and that if you're a creationist, you believe in God, and if you're an evolutionist, you don't. Scott points out that there are a lot of evolutionists who do believe in God. And that's really her main point. Now, in the course of making this point, she discusses these various intermediate positions between the two extremes that she's going to set forth. And we want to go through these and talk about each of these because she makes some statements that I think are very common and very representative of the way a lot of people think about these issues, but that need to be challenged or corrected or perhaps nuanced in some ways. Now, the most extreme view that she talks about, and the one that has the fewest advocates on the earth at the present time, is flat earthism. Flat earthism is the first view that she talks about. Now, I can't read Eugenie Scott's mind. I don't know her motives for setting it up the way that she did, but I suspect, and maybe this is just me being a little bit suspicious, I suspect that she starts with flat earthism in order to do what is commonly known in logic as poisoning the well. That is, we're going to start with the view that is so extreme and, in fact, so ridiculous that, of course, almost everybody who reads this is going to agree that it's ridiculous and false and absurd, but she's going to tie it to a way of reading the Bible that she describes as biblical literalism. And so, given that if you're a young Earth creationist, or even an old Earth creationist to some extent, you would be in that category of a biblical literalist, somebody who thinks the Bible is giving us factual information about the origins of the earth and the origins of life and so forth, as well as historical events throughout the Bible. given that that's something that's going to be true of an old Earth and a young Earth creationist, biblical literalism has been thoroughly discredited before she even talks about those creationist views by this association with flat earthism. Because she says, and she emphasizes this over and over, that flat earthists, that's not as easy to say as it seems like it would be, that flat earthists are, she says, the most strict of biblical literalists. She admits that most biblical literalists don't hold to a flat earth, but she gives the impression that the origin of this belief is in the flat earth is simply a belief that the Bible should be read literally. Now, there's a problem here, and that is that flat earthism is a fairly modern phenomenon. Contrary to the popular convention, we talked about this the first week, the church, through most of its history, did not affirm a flat earth. The early church did not, the medieval church did not, and most Christians up to the present day have not believed in a flat earth. Sure, there were people who were completely ignorant of all philosophy, all science, all learning, in all cultures, not just in Christian cultures. If you had gone and asked them, they probably would have thought the earth was flat. But as far as the Christian movement itself, Christian theology, the writings of learned Christian authors throughout the centuries, they all agreed, with very few exceptions. I mean, a handful, that the earth was a globe, that it was a sphere, or close to spherical in shape. And this was the universally held view in the days of Galileo and all of those people. Galileo didn't have to argue against a flat earth because nobody in his day really believed in it. The flat earthist philosophy really arises in the 19th century. I know that's surprising, but it's true. There's some precedent for it before then, but really as a movement it doesn't take off until the 19th century, and take off really at this context really only means a few score people, that, or maybe 100 or a couple hundred people in the world who associated themselves with it. And in fact, now this is even more surprising, and I did not know this, and I recently came across this little tidbit of information. But it turns out that flat earthism really didn't take off and start getting thousands of followers until, are you ready for this, after the Apollo missions. It wasn't until after people started flying to the moon that flat earthism really took off. And so you have in the 1970s the Flat Earth Society swelling its numbers from a ragtag handful to over 3,000. That's as far as it ever got. In fact, it's lost members in the last decade or two. It's again going down. So flat earthism is a kind of blip in human history, and it's got nothing to do with belief in biblical literalism, although, of course, flat earthists attempt to show that the Bible, taken literally, supports their view. But the vast majority of Christians who read the Bible quite literally over the last 2,000 years did not come up with a flat earth. Now, the next view that Eugenie Scott talks about is geocentrism. And we've talked about this too, but not with the twist that we're going to explore a little bit here tonight. Geocentrism, as the word indicates by its element parts, means the belief that the earth is at the center of the universe. And Scott acknowledges that there aren't very many people that hold to geocentrism today either. But there are geocentrists that associate themselves with the young earth creationist movement. In fact, she reports, and this is true, as I understand it, that at the Bible Science Association Creationism Conference in 1985, there was a plenary session debate between two geocentrists and two creationists who did not hold to geocentrism. Now, I think that over the last 20, 25 years, geocentrism has fallen off a bit in young earth creationism, but it's still around, at least in more subtle forms. And Scott talks about a prominent geocentrist, or somebody who's a little bit like a geocentrist, in young earth creationism, named Russell Humphreys, and I'll say a little bit about him in just a bit. But Scott points out that geocentrists could appeal to the Bible in support of their view, because you find statements in the Bible describing the heavens as a dome, a solid, at least semi-spherical or spherical, depending on which view you took, but it generally is understood to be spherical, a hard, solid dome over the earth, that where the sun, moon, and stars were embedded in this particular structure, sometimes called the firmament. And there are poetic statements in the book of Job about God spreading out the skies hard as a molten mirror, and that God walks on the vault of heaven, picturing God walking on the outside of the universe across the hard vault dome that surrounds the earth. And so that picture, that imagery, certainly is a geocentric picture or image. But what Scott glosses over is that this is not the same thing as the Bible actually teaching geocentrism. It doesn't. It simply uses this kind of phenomenological language. I'm going to type out that word there, phenomenological. He actually said it correctly twice in a row. I think I'll quit while I'm ahead. And that is the idea that some of the language in the Bible, like language in the newspaper today, describes the cosmos as it appears from our vantage point, from our perspective visually, not as it actually is. And so we still talk about the sun rising and the sun setting, even though we don't believe that the sun gets up in the morning and races around the earth every day. That was the picture behind that terminology. The sun would get up in the morning and run around the earth, and it would go to bed at night. It would set. Well, that's not literal, and it never was. So, although Scott is correct that you can find geocentric imagery in the Bible, you can find all kinds of imagery in the Bible, and it's perhaps significant that the most explicit occurrences of this kind of language are in the book of Job, which is a highly poetic text. Scott also says, and I think here she's not quite correct, that in the Bible stars were small, bright objects rather than the massive suns, like our own sun, which is a star, and that the Bible endorses the idea that stars could literally fall to the earth. Well, here Scott has not read her Bible very carefully, because the term star in biblical usage had a broader or wider denotation, or, if you will, definitional meaning, than it does today. A star in biblical usage is any bright object in the sky other than the sun and the moon. That would include objects that we call planets, comets, and asteroids, at least, as well as the literal stars, or what we would call the literal stars, which are these sun-like, very large objects, gazillions of miles away. So, although the term star can refer to those objects in the Bible, it's a broader term which can refer to objects that literally can fall to the earth, like asteroids. Anyway, there's a lot more that could be said about that, but it's just, as it were, kind of a side note that the Bible is not endorsing or teaching the idea that stars are literally bright little skies embedded in a literal dome firmament. Now, then Scott says, in talking about geocentricity, she endorses this idea, this myth that we talked about 2 weeks ago, that geocentrism gave human beings a more exalted place in the cosmos than we now can acknowledge. She says, I'm going to read this sentence, 2 sentences. Ancient and modern geocentricity reflects the idea that the earth and its creatures, especially humans, are central to God. To symbolize this importance, God would have made Earth the center of the universe. Well, I'll read another sentence. Taking Earth out of this central position reduces its importance, which reduces, according to their interpretation, man's place as the most important element in creation. Now, the problem here is, this is based on a myth. Geocentrism, as it was understood throughout church history until it was abandoned after Galileo and Kepler, geocentrism was understood to place Earth in the least honorable, least exalted, most common and degraded of positions. The Earth was at the bottom of the barrel. It was at the lowest point of all the cosmos. The center was the worst place you could be, basically in the mush pot, and it's where all the heavy objects fall, and it's not where you really want to be. Where you really want to be is in heaven, which is outside of, beyond the cosmos, and beyond the physical realm, and outside or beyond, way beyond the earth. So Scott, like many people, fall for this mythology that somehow when Copernicus and Galileo showed that the Earth was not at the center of the universe, they demoted the Earth and its inhabitants to a less important place in the cosmos. Now, Scott isn't alone in this mythology. It's interesting how people who are very adamantly opposed to Christianity have seized upon this myth for their purposes, as well as some people who are adamantly trying to defend Christianity. Not very many, but some. Now, Carl Sagan is an example of the former. Carl Sagan said in his book Pale Blue Dot, and I'm quoting here, "The Earth is a very small stage in a vast arena. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves." End of quote. That's page 9 of Pale Blue Dot. This is a running theme in that book, that Copernicus demoted the Earth to a relatively insignificant place in the cosmos, and things got only worse with modern astronomy showing that we were just a mediocre planet circling a mediocre star in a mediocre galaxy in no particular place in the cosmos at all. Now, I frankly was surprised the first time I learned this some years back, that there are creationists who are advocating something like geocentrism and making the same mistake from the opposite end of the spectrum that Carl Sagan makes. As I pointed out just a few minutes ago, Scott identifies Russell Humphreys, a well-known young Earth creationist astronomer, as one who advocates something like geocentrism. And I want to be precise here. I took a look at an article by Humphreys, which you can find on the Answers in Genesis website. Now, somebody's already mentioned that. Answers in Genesis is a leading young earth creationist organization, ministry, publishes resources defending the young earth creationist understanding of origins, probably more prominent now than the Institute for Creation Research, which is kind of the granddaddy of them all, but Answers in Genesis is a much more vigorous, much more aggressive, and much more prominent organization now in American young earth creationism. So on the Answers in Genesis website, you can find this article, which was written by Humphreys and published in 2002 in its their technical journal, where he explains that he thinks the Milky Way galaxy is at the center of the universe. He claims that new evidence has surfaced, and I'm quoting now, quote, "New evidence has surfaced that restores man to a central place in God's universe," end quote. Now you can see here that Humphreys is laboring under this misperception that Copernicanism, the idea that the earth is not at the center of the universe, demotes man to a lesser place in the cosmos. Humphreys, in fact, calls his belief, his position, a counter-Copernican revolution. Now, what exactly is his view? It's not geocentrism, at least not technically. He distinguishes his view from geocentrism, and let me quote him on this so that you'll get it straight from the source. Quote, "Our galaxy is essentially at the center of the cosmos, but not at rest with respect to it." In other words, our galaxy is moving. This differs from geocentrism, which would have the Earth be at the exact center and motionless with respect to it. And so, according to Humphreys, then, our galaxy is at the center of the universe, and the Earth is approximately at the center of the universe, but it's not motionless, and the galaxy is not motionless. Well, I'm not going to argue the science here of this that Humphreys tries to develop. I'm simply pointing out that his premise is this faulty premise, historically speaking at least, that having man at the center of the universe puts him in the pinnacle position, the greatest position, the most exalted location, and that taking him out of the center of the universe demotes him in significance. That's a myth that we've been sold over the past 150 years or so. Now, Humphreys is an example of a young earth creationist, and Scott goes on to talk about young earth creationism. I don't have too much to say about what she says regarding young earth creationism. It's a fairly accurate description of the movement. She rightly points out that what we know as young earth creationism today can be traced back primarily to one book, other than the Bible, of course, which they would certainly argue is the source of it. But as far as the modern exposition of young earth creationism, the book in question would be The Genesis Flood, which was co-authored by Henry Morris and John C. Whitcomb. Henry Morris went on to found the Institute for Creation Research, which was the leading young earth creationist organization in the 1960s and 1970s, at least, and is still a prominent organization in the movement. What was significant about the Genesis Flood was it was a book that very thoroughly offered an argument, a scientific argument, for a global flood, explaining the geological formations on the planet, the distribution of fossils, etc., etc., And it is really with the book, The Genesis Flood, that we have the origin of what is commonly called flood geology, which again is a kind of a science unique to young Earth creationists in the past 50 years or so, arguing that the flood of Noah explains much of the geology that other scientists, most scientists, explain in some other way. And again, I'm not trying I'm not going to comment on this. I'm just trying to give you the background here and understand the different points of view. Now, one thing that's very important to understand that Scott, to her credit, and I really want to, I'm not a fan of Eugenie Scott, but I want to credit her with having acknowledged some very important points about the different forms of creationism. And one of the points that she acknowledges is that young Earth creationists, and old Earth creationists for that matter, accept the idea of evolution at least to a certain extent. That is, most young Earth creationists, in fact, I don't know of any exceptions now, they accept the idea that a variety of creatures that modern scientists classify as belonging to different species had a common ancestor. So, for example, cats, the cat family, which would include lions and tigers and leopards and bobcats and, tabby cats that you have in the house and so forth, according to evolutionary theory, all stem from a common ancestor. And most young Earth creationists, if not all of them, would completely agree with that, have no problem with that, would not try to argue against the idea of a common ancestor for the house cat, the tiger, and the lion. Now, that's a change, perhaps, from earlier forms of creationism prior to Darwin, where it was generally assumed that these different species of animals were each created separately, but it's not something that is in any way a major change in creationism to acknowledge that there is that kind of moderate form of evolution. Now, then Scott talks about old Earth creationism, and she makes the point, which is a very good point and needs to be acknowledged, that a lot of scientists, most scientists really, prior to the emergence of Darwin's theory of evolution in his book in 1859, most scientists who studied the issue had already concluded that the Earth was far older than 6,000 to 10,000 years old. They'd already decided it was at least in the millions of years old prior to Darwinism. So the theory that the Earth is millions or even now billions of years old was not something that was cooked up in order to make evolution possible. It was something that was a theory that was developed, and you could argue did make it possible for evolutionism, as Darwin explained it, to be feasible. But the theory or the conclusion that the Earth was millions or even longer years old was something that was developed by scientists who were, generally speaking, what we would classify as creationists. They were generally Christians, and they were scientists who were committed to a creationist understanding of origins of living things, but nevertheless they held that the universe and the Earth was much older than several thousand years old. Now, Scott distinguishes different kinds of old Earth creationism, and these really have to do primarily not with how creation is understood or how evolution is understood, but how Genesis 1 is interpreted. And the two that she identifies that are specifically relevant here would be what she calls gap creationism and day-age creationism. Now, there are other views, and we're going to talk about these next week. But gap creationism is a largely discredited view. Very few people in young Earth creationist camp circles hold to this anymore. Very, very few. And in fact, it's not a young Earth creationist view. It's an old Earth creationist view, but it's a literal 6 days view, which is the confusing part of it. According to gap creationism, as again Eugenie Scott calls it, God created the universe in Genesis 1:1. Then there was some kind of a disaster that took place, and millions or billions of years went by, and then about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, God recreated or restored his creation in a period of 6 literal 24-hour days. And so all of the ages of geology basically are dumped between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Now, there are serious problems with that exegetically in terms of how you understand the wording of Genesis 1 verses 1 to 2. There are also serious scientific difficulties in making that scenario work in any kind of conjunction with Genesis 1. And so very, very few creationists of any stripe endorse gap creationism, although there still are a few, and they come sometimes in surprising places. But nevertheless, it's a very small minority at this point that hold to it. Now, another form of old Earth creationism, which is much more vigorous these days and very prominent, and many people equate this with old Earth creationism, although that's a mistake. They're not identical or, exhaustive of each other, is day-age creationism. The day-age view maintains that the 6 days of Genesis 1 correspond, at least roughly, to 6 long periods of time or long ages in which God did the creative acts described in Genesis chapter 1. On this view, Genesis 1 is historically accurate and historically factual in what it reports God doing, but the days themselves, the 6 days, do not need to be taken literally. I will talk more about this, obviously, when we get into Genesis 1 next week. Now, one point that Scott makes in her essay here and in the book where it later appeared that I think I should comment on briefly, she says that there are certain anomalies that don't fit easily with the day-age view, where, for example, she says flowering plants are created before animals and birds are created before land animals if you take the Genesis 1 days in consecutive chronological order, and that doesn't match up with the fossil record, according to Scott, and therefore there's a problem in correlating the days as ages with the scientific evidence. Well, day-age creationists make a couple of points here. I'll mention these briefly, and just so you know what the view is. They generally explain the days as being overlapping or having fuzzy edges. When does a day really end and another day begin? It's sort of a matter of convention. And the other point that they make is that the terms that are used in Genesis do not necessarily correspond with modern scientific classifications, or even the English translations may not be entirely accurate. So, for example, the term birds, according to some old Earth creationists, is really a broader term referring to any flying animals of any kind, and so that would include insects. I assume it would include pterodactyls. It would include anything that flies or that has wings. And if you take that understanding of the word translated birds, then there's no problem, for example, on that particular score. Scott also talks about progressive creationism, but frankly, there's no significant difference that I've ever been able to see between old Earth creationism and progressive creationism. And in fact, progressive creationism is something that is held by day-age advocates and so forth. So I don't see the point in separating them out from other kinds of old earth creationists. She also talks about what she calls evolutionary creationists, but I'm not sure why, because as she says, it would seem that evolutionary creationists are really theistic evolutionists. So I'm not going to treat that as a separate category. All right, now, at this point, we need to talk about intelligent design. And Scott introduces intelligent design as another form of creationism. Now, this is very confusing, and I'll tell you why it's confusing. In part, it's confusing. The fault here does not lie entirely with Scott. It also lies at least partly with some advocates of the intelligent design movement. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that it is something that needs to be addressed, perhaps more clearly. As Scott points out herself, some intelligent design advocates are evolutionists. That is, they accept the idea of common descent from an original organism. They accept the idea that cats and dogs and bears and chimps and humans and roses and et cetera, that they all have a common ancestor. There are intelligent design advocates who agree with that. There are also intelligent design advocates who disagree with it. Intelligent design is a position that has a broader range of possibilities with regards to evolution. And there are some who are theistic evolutionists and some who are not. And so it all depends on which one you're talking about, exactly where they fit in the spectrum. So it's a little bit confusing then, when Scott acknowledges this point, for her to describe it as intelligent design creationism. Now, why does she do that? Well, the reason why she does it is because all of the intelligent design advocates, at least the ones that I know of, they all critique neo-Darwinian evolutionism and critique the idea of evolution as something that can explain the origins of species in a completely naturalistic way. In other words, the intelligent design movement may acknowledge, and some of the advocates of the intelligent design movement may acknowledge common descent, that these different kinds of creatures have a common ancestor, but they critique the idea or criticize the idea that came about through a kind of unguided, unintelligent, unplanned, non-purposeful natural process. So you'll find intelligent design advocates saying things like, this is not something that could happen through unguided natural processes alone. They're not denying that natural processes might have been involved, you see. They're simply saying, these natural processes by themselves can't do it. Especially important to the intelligent design movement is the claim that natural selection is not a sufficient engine of innovation in living things to be able to have produced all the different kinds of animals and plants that we see on the earth. Natural selection is a very important concept in evolutionary theory, and we will be talking about that at some length later in this course. But the basic idea of natural selection is that those organisms, if you got a population of organisms, let's say a population of roses, or could be a population of trout, could be any number of things. We'll go with the population of trout, just as an example. You got a population of trout. Natural selection says the trout that are best able to survive long enough to reproduce are the trout that tend to pass on their particular characteristics that distinguish them from other trout. So, for example, if it's helpful to be a certain color or have a certain shininess of the exterior, if you're a trout, in order to, or a lack of shininess, in order to escape being eaten before you can reproduce, then those trout that have that characteristic, maybe the trout that can swim the fastest, because of their design, or their structure as they swim through the water. That natural selection says those trout that are best able to survive long enough to pass on their genes are the ones that survive and pass on their genes, and so their offspring will be like them, and there'll be more of that offspring than there will be of the offspring of the trout that didn't have those characteristics. Well, that's the idea of natural selection. The debate between intelligent design theorists and evolutionists of the general, usual kind at least, neo-Darwinists, the debate is whether natural selection is an innovative or creative force that is able to produce entirely new kinds of structures. For example, you could understand how natural selection could result in some trout, in a population of trout over time becoming faster swimmers, blending into their surroundings underwater better than other trout in the past, etc., etc. But could you expect natural selection to produce trout with feet, able to crawl out of the water onto the land when necessary? Well, that would be different. And so, at least according to ID theorists, that's the kind of thing natural selection can't do. So, just to make clear, intelligent design does not necessarily reject the idea of evolution or even common descent as a reality historically, but they question whether that could have happened without some kind of intelligent creator, some kind of intelligent supernatural being guiding the process, engineering things so that it gets done the way that it gets done. All right, now the next view that Scott talks about is theistic evolution. By the way, in just a few minutes, we're going to have time for your questions. We're going to have a Q&A period and discussion time, so that's just a few minutes off, so hang with me here and we'll get to that. Theistic evolution is the idea, as I said before, that God created the world and is in some way responsible for evolution, uses evolution to bring about the development of the different kinds of living things that we see on the earth. And there are different varieties of theistic evolution. As Scott, again, to her credit, acknowledges, there are different varieties of theistic evolution. There are theistic evolutionists who believe that God does no miracles at all after he creates the world. He simply sets it in motion, and he is so wise and in his planning and his design of the universe in its initial conditions that he could know ahead of time that things would unfold in such a way that the earth would emerge as an environment favorable to life, and that living things would originate on the earth and evolve, and human beings would arise as a result. And no additional miracles are required. So there are theistic evolutionists who believe basically in one miracle, and that is the miracle of the original creation. Then there are theistic evolutionists who would add to that. Maybe they believe in two miracles, the origin of the universe and the origin of life. Maybe there's a third, the origin of the human species, the origin of the human race. The usual, I think most common view of theistic evolution is the view that all living creatures on the earth evolved naturally from a common ancestor, but including human beings, but that human beings did not become human beings per se until God created the soul, the immaterial, non-physical, transcendent aspect of a human being that becomes part of his being with his physical body, and that did not evolve from other animals. That was something that God had to create within the first human beings. And that's probably the most common form of theistic evolution. Well, then Scott talks about agnostic evolutionism, which basically is evolution without any worldview commitments that are made explicit or acknowledged. The agnostic evolutionist says, well, evolution is how we got here. Whether there was a God behind it all or not, we don't know, and we're not prepared to say. Then Scott talks about materialistic evolution. Now, materialistic evolutionism is really atheistic, or at least non-theistic evolution. It is the belief that the universe is a purely material phenomenon which did not have a non-material or supernatural origin or creator, and there is no supernatural God, creator, guiding the process of evolution, engineering it to make sure it works out the way it works out, or anything like that. Everything is to be explained in a purely materialistic or naturalistic fashion. Now, at this point, Scott introduces an important distinction which has been extremely controversial for the last, couple of decades at least. And it has to do with what science presupposes when you are doing science with regard to what kinds of explanations are in order, or what kinds of explanations are legitimate in science. According to Scott, and probably most scientists today would agree with this, the scientist, to do science properly, must work from the methodology of assuming that you are looking for a natural cause, that you're looking for a natural explanation. Now, this is known as methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is an approach to science, an understanding of the rules of the game of science, which says if you're going to do science, you can only entertain natural explanations for things. Now, according to Scott, the methodological naturalist is not saying there aren't supernatural causes. The methodological naturalist is not denying that there is a God, not saying that there isn't. In fact, you could be a methodological naturalist and firmly and devoutly believe in God, and credit God with the grandeur of the cosmos and the rest of it. But as far as offering explanations for how things work or how things come about in the history of the cosmos or the history of life on Earth, Scott says, the methodological naturalist says, for the sake of doing science properly, I'm not going to entertain supernatural explanations. Period. I'm only going to entertain natural explanations. Now, she distinguishes this from what she calls philosophical naturalism. It's usually called metaphysical or ontological naturalism. Ontological naturalism is the belief that there are only natural explanations possible because there are only natural causes. Ontological naturalism says there are no supernatural beings, or at least if there are supernatural beings, they never get involved in the material or natural realm, and so you cannot even believe in supernatural explanations for anything. You cannot believe in supernatural beings as having anything to do with the world because they just don't exist. Now, there are those who argue that if you are a methodological naturalist, you are acting as if you believed in ontological naturalism, even if you say you don't. Now, this criticism is made by Christians, and it's also made by atheists, interestingly enough. For example, an atheist named Stephen Schaefersman, in an article entitled "Naturalism is Today an Essential Part of Science," he argues that methodological naturalism, as Scott and others have defined it, is implicitly insincere. You're saying, I'm only going to look for natural explanations, but I really believe in other kinds as well. It is an attempt, according to Schaefersman, to have it both ways, to save appearances. So the scientist can say, well, yes, I happen to believe in God, but I leave God out of the equation. When I walk into the lab, I leave God out of the room. I don't bring him in with me. He doesn't have anything to do with my explanations. He doesn't have anything to do with science. But I happen to believe in him. And Schaefersman asks, isn't that insincere? If you really believe in God, why aren't you willing to entertain him as a possible explanation for things? And Christian philosophers of science, like J.P. Moreland, have made exactly the same point from their perspective. If you are a theist, if you are a Christian who believes in God as the creator of the universe, why wouldn't you at least be open to the possibility that some things that have happened in the history of the cosmos have been the result of a miraculous intervention on the part of that creator? So you can see that there is some serious debate, even among evolutionists, as to whether methodological naturalism presupposes or requires a commitment to ontological naturalism, and there is a debate over whether scientists should be methodological naturalists. Now, what are the reasons given? I'll close with this, and then we'll have our discussion time. What reasons do most scientists who hold to this methodological naturalism give as to why we should operate on this assumption? Well, I think there are two, and they're related. One is what has been called the argument from success. And it goes like this. When we have stopped appealing to God to explain things we don't understand, and we've looked for natural explanations, by golly, we keep finding them. And in finding these natural explanations, it empowers us to take control of the world around us and to manipulate it and to get things done. We're able to build computers and rocket ships and all kinds of wonderful things. We're able to chart the weather and do all sorts of fun things and important things that improve the human condition. We're able to cure diseases. And on we could go, listing all the accomplishments of science operating on the assumption that what we need to find are natural explanations for things. So when somebody gets sick, we don't say, well, that was a demon. We say, well, let's try to find out what's causing this particular condition. And once we find out the chemical or biochemical reasons for it, maybe we can do something about it. So this is what is known as the argument from success. Now, a related argument would be that when the scientist stops looking for a natural explanation and appeals to a supernatural explanation, such as saying God did it, that he is really short-circuiting the process of investigation. Once you say God did it, you're no longer looking for answers. You're no longer trying to understand things. You're just saying, well, I don't get it, so I guess God did it. And you could see how these would be very closely related objections to allowing supernatural explanations in science. Well, on the other side of the coin, Christian philosophers of science who reject methodological naturalism say, well, of course, science has been very successful in many ways when it's looked for natural explanations for things like why people get a cold, or get sick with something. There's a lot of things that science has been very successful in allowing us to do by finding these natural explanations. But there are certain things that science just can't do. And if we're going to be honest truth seekers, we ought to be willing to consider the possibility that science is going to run into things that aren't best explained naturalistically. Now, I think it might be helpful, and I don't know if others have made this suggestion, so I'm not claiming originality here, but my own thinking, I have distinguished between what I would call a hard methodological naturalism and a soft methodological naturalism. A hard methodological naturalism really is basically assuming that ontological naturalism is true, at least for the sake of science. It's not allowing any supernatural explanation whatsoever, no matter what. So if God were to create an enormous display of his supernatural power in the sky, rip open the heavens and appear in bodily form, 100 miles high, and say, "Hey, down there, I'm God." If you're a hard methodological naturalist, you have to say, well, there's some kind of a alien being there that's extremely powerful, but he's just a natural phenomenon that we don't yet understand. If you're a soft methodological naturalist, you look for natural explanations as a matter of course before entertaining the possibility of supernatural explanations, but you don't rule out supernatural explanations a priori or before you even examine the facts. In other words, the soft methodological naturalist looks at supernatural explanations a little bit as a last resort after you've tried to find naturalistic explanations and have not been successful. But there's more than that. You can't simply say, well, we haven't found an explanation yet, natural explanation, so we'll just quit looking for one and saying that it's God. In a soft methodological naturalism, I would suggest the scientist can say, if I not only cannot find a natural explanation, but I also have what looks to be like positive evidence of intelligence behind this particular phenomenon, positive evidence of some kind of intentionality, some kind of purpose, some kind of meaningfulness, some kind of intelligent agent who's responsible for this. If I have positive evidence for that, I'm going to be open to that, and I'm going to entertain the possibility that there is a supernatural being responsible for this particular occurrence or this particular phenomenon. So I do think that it is possible to operate in science in a normal mode of looking for natural explanations without precluding the possibility of supernatural causes for specific events. And typically these would be specific events of a non-repeated nature. If we see something happen in the sky every 38 years, we probably are not going to put that down to a miracle. But if it only happens once in human history, we might. All right, well, those are my thoughts on methodological naturalism, and what I'd like to do at this point is to open it up for discussion. I will relinquish the microphone. Our moderators will take over. They will let you know when it's your turn to take the microphone and ask your question. If you're unable to use the microphone, you'll be able to type out your question and it will be read aloud, and then I will attempt to answer it as best I can. So we've got at least 20 minutes. We can go a little bit over that if need be, and I'll get off the microphone now.
Chad, a student of the class, began the Q&A session by asking Rob a question about the view of Adam and theistic evolution and how the two can be reconciled. Here's how Rob replied.
Well, we will probably be getting into these kinds of questions again in subsequent weeks when we look at Genesis. I would say my own opinion is this is a very difficult point for theistic evolution. I have been reading recently some of the leading theistic evolutionists, like Francis Collins, who likes to quote C.S. Lewis. So he's got that going for him. I have read them try to explain how to interpret the fall of Adam and Paul's teaching on this within a theistic evolutionary context, and I see nothing but contortions. I see it being very difficult for them to pull off. So I may be wrong about that, but I mean, at this point, it looks to me like theistic evolution has a very difficult time explaining or incorporating the notion of a fall. Now, if you held that the first man and first woman literally were an Adam and Eve, that were the first human-like creatures that had a soul, and as such were qualitatively different from any of the animals that had preceded them, and that those were the first two people, and that when they got that soul they were perfectly innocent and sinless, and then literally fell into sin historically, as the book of Genesis describes, I guess it would be possible to take that view and hold a kind of a modified or moderate attenuated theistic evolution. But most theistic evolutionists have great difficulty with this. I'm not saying they all do, because again, there are different kinds of theistic evolution, but the ones that I've been reading lately, they trip over this particular question, in my opinion.
Someone visiting the room asked a question regarding the writings of Cornelius Hunter, and he was wondering if Rob was familiar with him, and if so, what he thought of his writings. Here's how Rob responded.
I'm going to address your first question, and then I'm going to ask you to repeat your second one, because I'm not sure I quite got it, and I think somebody else had the same problem. Maybe we're just tired this evening here, but yes, Cornelius Hunter, I am familiar with him. I liked his book, Darwin's God. Thought that he did a pretty good job in that book of showing that Darwin's understanding of evolution was shaped in significant ways by the problem of evil. This is something that is really worth thinking about. He was operating, according to Hunter, from a kind of Victorian understanding about God, which is that if God makes things, it all has to be pretty and clean and bright and happy and perfect, and God can't make anything that is anything less than that. And so naturally, Darwin notices in the world of life that things are not always pretty and bright and clean and shiny, that animals eat each other and kill each other, and cats play with mice and things like that. And Darwin felt that these things were inconsistent with the Victorian concept of God as he had understood it from traditional British Christianity. Well, I think that Hunter does a good job of explaining all that. I didn't think that Hunter did a particularly good job of responding to the challenge. That is, he didn't give us an alternative, at least not in that book, of, well, if that understanding of God and evil and suffering in the natural world, in the biological world, if that understanding is incorrect, how should we think about these things? I didn't feel that Hunter addressed that question adequately. I liked that book better than I liked Darwin's Proof, which was the follow-up book that he did after Darwin's God. But I thought Darwin's God was a pretty good book. Now, if you could repeat your second question, we'll try to address that as well.
The same visitor asked Rob a question regarding the evidence that scientists use to determine a common ancestor for humanity, and he was wondering why they could not go a step further and use that same evidence to conclude there's a common creator. Here's how Rob responded.
Well, I don't know that we need to accuse the scientists who embrace evolutionism of hypocrisy here, because again, if we grant them the operating procedure or premise of methodological naturalism, that's the direction they've got to go. That they've got to look for a natural explanation that leaves out any kind of supernatural causation. If that's what you've got to do, some form of evolutionism has to be the answer. I think, and so that is the short answer there. Now, I think that it is fair to say that the macroevolutionary grand hypothesis that all living things on the earth arose from a single common ancestor. That particular grand theory is an inference at best from all the evidence. It's not something you can just read off of the evidence. It's not the only possible explanation of the evidence. It's certainly a plausible explanation of a lot of the evidence, at least the way that it's been presented and understood. Is it the only explanation? I don't think so. But we will talk about that in great detail in a few weeks after we've looked at what the Bible says, and we'll get to that, and we'll look at the evidence pro and con, and we'll talk about those evidences as much as we can. So let me allow somebody else here to jump in with a question.
Paul, a student of the course, asked Rob to elaborate further on the difference between the day-age creation view versus the old earth creation view. Here's how Rob replied.
Well, day-age creationism is just one form of old earth creationism. It's probably the most popular form right now, but it's just another version of old earth creationism. There's other versions. There's the gap theory form of old earth creationism. There's the framework hypothesis reading of Genesis 1 that is not day-age and it's not gap theory. It's another way of reading Genesis 1. There are others as well. We'll talk about these next week. There's about a dozen different interpretations of Genesis 1 current in evangelical Christianity. Some of them are more popular than others, but there's about a dozen of them, not just one or two. And the day-age view is just one form of old earth creationism.
Daniel, a student of the theology program, asked Rob to elaborate further on methodological naturalism. Here's how Rob responded.
Yeah, Daniel, I think that you're basically correct that methodological naturalists would say, in one sense, that's all science really can do is look at the natural explanations. When you get into the supernatural, you've left the competency of science and you're dealing with theology. The problem with that is that it precludes the possibility that the physical evidence might point to something beyond the cosmos. And that's where those who reject methodological naturalism, I think, have a very strong objection. If what we want to do is to look for the truth, we have to be willing to entertain possibilities that may frustrate the scientists' attempts to find all-encompassing natural explanations for things. In other words, let's say that here's an analogy, and this is the kind of analogy that intelligent design theorists in particular have used, I think, to pretty good effect. Let's say somebody has died, and you're trying to find a natural explanation. And you define a natural explanation as something like he had a disease, he had an accident, something just physical happened to him. It wasn't anybody's fault. It just something happened. And those are the only kinds of explanations that you will entertain. And, as in your investigation, you discover that this person was poisoned. You say, aha, I've got my natural explanation. I don't need to search any further. I've decided that it's a natural explanation. But then another scientist comes along, another toxicologist comes along and says, this is kind of strange. This poison that was in this person's system is not something that occurs naturally. That is, it doesn't occur out in the wild. It's not something that occurs. You can't get this poison by eating something. You're picking a plant or a flower or something and eating it. You can't get this poison by food poisoning. The only place you ever find this poison is in a laboratory, something that has to be manufactured. And so the toxicologist says, it looks like, yes, this person died of poison, but it looks like he was killed. It looks like he was murdered because it appears that he was poisoned deliberately by some agent, some individual, some person who intended to create this poison and cause this individual to ingest it. Well, that's appealing to an explanation that is beyond simply the natural phenomena. It's appealing to something that has to do with a person's intention, planning, or purpose. And there are scientists that seem perfectly comfortable with that when we're talking about a toxicology report, but are very uncomfortable if the agent is implicitly something beyond the cosmos. And I think the theistic individual, the Christian philosopher, the Christian theist has every right to say, why not? Why not allow the possibility of a creator being responsible for something like the origin of life on the earth? Of course, we're not going to say if somebody got poisoned, died of some kind of strange poisoning, a devil manufactured the poison, or God poisoned him. That would be that would not be the kind of explanation that you would search for in those cases. But when we're talking about something like the origin of life on the planet, perhaps it would be appropriate to allow for the possibility that a creator of the universe is responsible for it.
Chad, return to the mic to ask a question regarding methodological naturalism and how we can reconcile that with our hermeneutic of Genesis. Here's how Rob replied.
Well, this is a nice segue into our discussion next week, because this is what we're going to be talking about next week, is the hermeneutical issues with regards to how you read a passage like Genesis 1 through 3. What kinds of expectations do we tend to bring to the text? Are these expectations justified or warranted? How should we read Genesis 1? There are lots of views on this now, and it's not easy to untangle all of them or to sort them all out. So we're going to have to spend a fair amount of time on this, and I do think that hermeneutics is key. That people who have different understandings of what Genesis says or implies with regards to origins bring different hermeneutical assumptions to the passage. And generally speaking, and I'll say this even though this really is going to get me into some hot water that we'll have to wait till next week to extricate myself from it. But generally speaking, young earth creationists approach not just Genesis but the whole Bible with a hermeneutical mindset of, we're going to take the Bible as literally as possible. That is, literal is the default way of reading a text, and of course some things you can't take literally. The Bible has poetry in it, it uses symbolic language, it uses figurative language. There are genres of literature that clearly are not meant to be read in a straightforward or woodenly literal fashion, but we're going to read them as literally as possible. And so it isn't an accident, in my judgment, that most young earth creationists also tend to read biblical eschatology in as literal a fashion as possible. That is, most young earth creationists tend to prefer a system of eschatology that at least purports to take biblical prophetic passages, and even passages in the book of Revelation, as literally as possible. Now again, I want to qualify. They do not claim we need to take everything in the Bible literally. They're quite clear on this. You can't take everything literally, but they want to take as much of it literally as possible. Now, at the other extreme, you have people who read the Bible in the exact opposite way. They want to take the Bible symbolically, except when forced to do otherwise. They want to. The whole Bible is to be read as a collection of metaphors, and if there is something that's literally true in the Bible, well, okay, but that would be the exception rather than the rule. Now, that's an extreme view, but there are people that hold that view. They're admitting that some things in the Bible are literal. You'll find people saying, well, of course, Jesus was a real person and he really died and all that, but they're not prepared to agree that most of what the Bible says is literally the case. Those are the two ends of the spectrum, and in between those two extremes, there are a variety of resting places possible. And so what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about this with regards to Genesis 1 in particular, and we'll try to think through the issue together. We probably won't all agree when we're done, but at least we'll have thought it through. And I think that we're going to go ahead and end with that because it does set us up nicely for next week. I would encourage you to read Genesis 1 very carefully between now and next class session. In the lecture notes, which are available to those of you who are enrolled in the course, there is a couple of pages there of Genesis 1 that is color-coded in order to enable you to notice some of the parallelisms throughout the first chapter of Genesis. So you might want to take a look at that and read through the other pages that are relevant to Genesis 1 before we get together next time, and then you'll kind of be in a position of knowing what we're talking about as we get into the subject matter.